Hello, everyone. I am Overthink podcast co-host David Peña-Guzmán, and I am here with co-host Ellie Anderson.
Hello.
And we want to have a chat about the very nature, definition, and possibly also the boundaries of philosophy
Yeah,
as
no,
a
I mean
discipline.
the boundaries of philosophy. That's what.
Possibly. The question is whether there are boundaries.
Okay, but I think we're framing this as the
The
boundaries
boundaries
of
of
philosophy.
philosophy.
So
Yes. And the when you think about what philosophy is, the simplest answer is that it is the love of wisdom. It comes from the Greek roots for love and for knowledge or wisdom.
and specifically philia, which is friendly love,
A
as
friendly love,
opposed
yes.
to eros or agape.
Yes, a more transcendental or sexual love. So we love philosophy. We love wisdom, but in a friendly way.
Yeah, we're friends of wisdom.
We're friends of Sophia. And I thought that we would talk about how we both see philosophy because I suspect that we might have different views potentially about whether or not it's even possible to articulate an account of what philosophy is that would neatly separate it from other disciplines that are neighboring it.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to begin just by asking you that question, whether you think, Ellie, that there is something inherent or intrinsic to philosophy and to the act of philosophizing that creates this discipline that differs, say, from sociology, from anthropology, from literature, so on and so forth.
In answering this question, it's important to consider the history of how the disciplines emerged to begin with. Because for much of human history, what we now consider to be those other disciplines were part of philosophy. You only get the splitting off of sociology, anthropology, psychology, political science in the past couple of centuries. And even though you had the splitting off of the natural sciences from philosophy a few
Earlier,
centuries
yes.
previously, originally those were also part of the purview of philosophy. So, for instance, in ancient Greece, philosophy had a very broad scope, such that many of the disciplines we now recognize today would have fallen under its purview. You can see this, for instance, in the fact that Aristotle wrote a book on physics. He wrote a book on biology. He wrote a book on ethics.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book on the nature of reality. He wrote a book on rhetoric. He wrote a book on theater, right? Like there's all of these areas of inquiry that you find in ancient thought that reveal just how broad philosophy's scope is. And so, although I absolutely recognize and respect that sociology, anthropology, psychology, and so forth have become disciplines in their own right more recently, which means that they have specific areas of inquiry, specific methods that characterize them autonomously, I do not think that there is something intrinsically that separates philosophy from those disciplines. And so, part of what's been challenging in the past really century, a little bit more than that, is that philosophy has had to redefine its role because its scope has been whittled away by the fact that other disciplines have branched off.
And I would say, aside from the fact that yes, historically the lines have been blurred, even at the acme or the most intense moment of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, the people that we now associate as the fathers of science, of modern science and modern physics,
We're all philosophers.
yeah, I mean, they were called natural philosophers.
Yeah.
So they were philosophers whose object was nature, its
Exactly.
dynamics, its lawful regularities.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right that the history of specialization really is a much more narrow, more recent history having to do with the rise of the university,
Yeah.
having to do with the rise of departments, so on and so forth. But in that reality, we do face departments of philosophy that in
Mhm.
some ways have to articulate what it is that separates them from other ones. And one of the ways in which this is sometimes articulated is in terms of the objectlessness of philosophy, the fact that philosophy has kind of this freedom
Yeah.
to talk about so many aspects of reality, so many aspects of the world that are not accessible in the same way to other disciplines.
Mhm.
In the math department, there will be a lot of people who specialize in math, in numbers,
I mean,
in functions.
presumably everyone specializes in
Yes.
math in the math department.
Yes, exactly. But you could have a philosopher of mathematics
Yeah.
who is just as much an expert in those questions,
Mhm.
but who is actually in a philosophy department. And the same thing for philosophy of physics. There's always philosophy of insert any other discipline
Yeah.
in a way that the reverse is not always true, right?
The reverse is usually not true.
Yeah, it's usually not true. So there's philosophy of mathematics, but there's no mathematics of philosophy. And so one possible way of articulating the difference is that it has to do with this unbounded freedom to pursue wisdom, in a friendly, loving way, and follow it wherever it might lead you.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to remember who it was. Maybe I can find it, actually, because I think Dennett talks about it in this book, Intuition Pumps. Might have been Gilbert Ryle, who talks about philosophy as the study of how things hang together in the most
In the broadest possible sense, yes.
Who was that?
I honestly don't remember who said that, but it's commonly cited in discussions about philosophy.
Okay, so we're going to keep going with this video, but if you're watching on YouTube, we will have just put it in the video.
Who said that?
As a caption. So we are properly checking our sources.
Yeah,
probably citing our sources.
Somebody did say that. And the idea is that what philosophy allows you to do is take a panoramic view upon a body of knowledge or a series of facts and unify them. And this is tied to that image of philosophy that does emerge with if you trace the history of philosophy, especially in the West, the notion of philosophy as the queen of the sciences, the one that stands above the rest and in some ways gives order to the body of knowledge that all the other sciences are generating from the ground up. So here, seeing how things hang in the broadest possible sense of the term is an act of governing or of regulation.
Well, and not necessarily on this governing point, but I do think there is something to the stereotype that philosophy asks big questions. And it asks big questions in different ways. There isn't just one way of asking big questions. There isn't just one domain of big questions that philosophy asks. But I find that to be a useful way of framing it, at least in terms of the kinds of things that I'm doing in my everyday life, right? Thinking about ontology, the study of being, thinking about ethics, thinking about whether or not humans have freedom and what the nature of the will is. Those are things that philosophers typically study.
Yeah, so
we have a lot of freedom to do so. That's a nice thing about philosophy. It has a lot of freedom to it.
It has a lot of freedom, and it means that you can pursue big questions. And this has been historically the dominant argument as to the specificity and the difference of philosophy. That it would sort of tackle the biggest questions that other disciplines couldn't. Of course, I could imagine somebody in a different discipline saying something like, well, physics tackles maybe equally big questions. About the nature of reality.
Or somebody saying, well, philosophy might ask big questions, but
it gives little answers.
Well, and even worse than that, is it asking them in the right way, too?
Yes, is it asking them in the right way? Now,
we obviously think that philosophy can offer some answers because we are philosophers, but...
Yeah, well, I don't even know if I believe that philosophy can give answers, per se, but I do think it can help us ask questions in a productive, challenging way. And sometimes philosophers will say that there is value in just knowing the question that you have to ask, even if there's no answer to it.
Okay, but I want to push you a little bit on that, because this is your book, When Animals Dream. This is not like a promotional video. It literally just happened to be behind me. And it is the second book I pulled out, so it's not the only one. It's not a plant. Because in this book, you do state a lot of things. You're not just asking questions. So, now that I am facing you with your own baby, don't you think this has answers?
Yes, it definitely has all the answers that you will need for living a good life. But my point, and this is interesting because I have been told by people that what they like about this text is that it's not just philosophy. That there is a good amount of empirical science.
Okay.
And so it's unclear whether what people experience as the answers of it come from the philosophical or the scientific side, or a combination of the two.
But you develop a theory of consciousness in this text, and that theory of consciousness is not,
but it's
science. It's grounded in science, but I would say it's philosophical.
Yeah, but especially
I would actually say scientist philosophers of I would actually say scientist theories of consciousness are philosophies as well.
Exactly, and there are just as many philosophies of consciousness as there are philosophers of consciousness. And so it's not as if I've found the answer to what consciousness is, an answer that could sort of trump or falsify other ones.
Okay.
I've added another lens, another interpretation.
Sure. Yeah.
And so is that an answer? Well, sure. Is it the answer? No, not in the same way. And so...
but I think that's fine. Like, I don't
fine.
think... I think actually this is also the case in the sciences as well, too, that, of course there are some questions that have a right or wrong answer. But there are many questions that have many different answers. And so if we think about philosophy as this pursuit of thinking, there's a dialectic there involving asking questions, developing answers to those questions. And those answers aren't necessarily going to be ultimate fixed answers. But that's part of the beauty of thought as well, is this journey of shaping our ideas.
Yeah, and so I'm realizing just how central this question of the boundaries of philosophy has been in my work, in various aspects of my work, even when I didn't realize it. Because when I used to publish more regularly on the history of science, this came up in the following way. So around the 19th century, this is an argument that I make in one of my publications, something really bizarre happened in science, in European science, that gave science a sudden freedom from philosophy.
Okay.
And sort of the queen of the sciences, philosophy, was dethroned.
Yeah.
And science sort of established itself, because for a long time, people would say what philosophy gives you is answers to metaphysical questions that physics and the natural sciences by definition can't tackle. But in the 19th century, there is what is sometimes called the second scientific revolution, which is this moment where scientific progress just sort of speeds up and it gets really interesting. Suddenly you have developments in mathematics that start sort of directly bearing on questions that philosophers have traditionally thought as their domain.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, there are developments in mathematical notions of infinity. Infinity is a metaphysical concept that philosophers normally would be, this is my turf.
Yeah.
Similarly, you start seeing the development of really complex theories of time in physics. Time is another sort of metaphysical subject that traditionally was the turf of philosophy. And so in thinking about the boundaries of philosophy, it's also the case that sometimes other disciplines have made claims upon the domain of philosophy, such that it's really unclear whether we can, even now in the age of departmental specialization, neatly separate the philosophers from the non-philosophers.
Well, that's what I was saying before about how what's now political science, sociology, anthropology, and so forth used to be philosophy. I think the most current development now, where you see this a lot, is neuroscience, which for most of the 20th century didn't care at all about questions of consciousness, now wonderfully has started to care about questions of consciousness. But you see all these neuroscientists coming out with books about consciousness, and at the same time there's still a broad cultural stereotype that philosophy is useless. I'm like, okay, look at that neuroscience book that just came out. That is a book of philosophy. It's grounded in neuroscience, sure, but it's still making philosophical claims. And I think, in a different angle. So there's this question of philosophy, of other disciplines encroaching, say, on philosophy. There's also a question of philosophy, quote unquote, encroaching on other disciplines as well.
Yes.
One of the things that I really like about philosophy, as I said before, is that we can basically study anything and do so in a philosophical way. One of my favorite anecdotes on this is from the existentialists, where there's this philosopher, Raymond Aron, who's not very well remembered by the tradition now, but he was friends with Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir as young people. And he heard about this new philosophy of phenomenology, actually, which, if you know from listening to our podcast or watching our videos, a lot of overlaps between phenomenology and existentialism. But he comes back from Germany where he was studying phenomenology, and he says, Beauvoir, Sartre, you guys won't believe it. If you study phenomenology, you can make philosophy out of this apricot cocktail, because they were at a bar in Paris drinking apricot cocktails. And so I think that's a beautiful way of showing that philosophy is in anything and everything. At the same time, however, I think that philosophy sometimes has a bit of a problem where we're overconfident because we are living in a society that undervalues us. So when you hear Neil deGrasse Tyson, for instance, like knock philosophy, as a philosopher, your tendency is to be like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's a philosophical claim that he's making. And I think that's right. But I also think that response, that knee-jerk response we have to be like, no, see, philosophy is in anything and everything, can kind of bite us in the back. Because I also think philosophy sometimes needs to be humble in recognizing the developments of other disciplines. And I'll give you an example here, which is from my work in feminist philosophy of love. The philosophy of love, generally speaking, has a lot to learn from other disciplines. Sure, we can learn from psychology and neuroscience about the biological correlates to the feeling or state of love. But I also think it's really important for us to learn from feminist history about the ways that loving relationships have been shaped over time. For instance, the bourgeois love match of monogamous heterosexual marriage that has developed in the past couple of hundred years is often the default that people see as the norm of loving relationships. And when philosophers try and philosophize in a vacuum about the nature of love without attending to the history and like learning from women's studies departments, and other disciplines, I think sociology as well. I've learned so much from sociology of love. I think we really do everybody a disservice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would never disagree with that. But again, this goes to this question of then what is it that sets us apart, especially in a world where, let's say, you can find people in a women's studies department or in a sociology department who are tackling theoretical questions in their discipline, that if you just put them in a philosophy department, they would blend right in. And when you have also people in philosophy departments, imagine you're a philosopher of physics or you're a philosopher of sociology. If you put them in a physics or sociology department, they also could kind of blend in. And so, the question here for me remains, how do we think about this difference? And I've thought about this for quite some time. And I wrote an article with a mutual friend of ours, Jessica Locke, called the boundlessness, the groundlessness of philosophy, where after thinking about this together, we sort of came to the conclusion that there is no ground to philosophy that could help you define it.
Okay.
That would give it any kind of stability. And so, and we've gotten some pushback on that account.
So what have people's responses been?
Well, people have proposed various ways of thinking about philosophy that would give you that definitional power.
I'm wondering what those are.
So, for instance, you could define philosophy as the discipline that deals with concepts and the manipulation of concepts.
Yeah.
You could define it as a field that is that specializes on a particular kind of method, like argumentation. You could also define it as the discipline that seeks to understand ultimate truth in some kind of fundamental metaphysical way.
Okay.
And so you can imagine various ways of defining philosophy. So that's one kind of push.
Yeah.
We also weirdly have gotten a kind of pragmatic, strategic, institutional push of people who say, look, you might be right, but making this argument at a time when philosophy departments are under threat of being cut is not particularly helpful, because when we go to talk to like our university presidents about why they shouldn't cut the philosophy department, we want them to believe that we do something.
They're like, I read this article and you don't actually have any specificity, so you're cut.
I know that's actually my response to that.
Your greatest contribution as a philosopher is to cut philosophy departments.
And it's not an attack on philosophy. It's not to say that philosophy doesn't exist. It's simply to say that it doesn't have clear boundaries and it doesn't have a foundation. So it's an anti-foundationalist take on this discipline.
Okay. And you do think that other disciplines have clear boundaries?
They have clearer boundaries, yeah, and
Clearer boundaries?
clearer boundaries, because, and I can say something about that. So there are disciplines where you can find unity in the discipline, for example, at the level of object. Mathematicians, they study number in all of its manifestations. You're never going to find a mathematician that studies love. That's just not the right object. Women studies faculty. They study sex, sexuality, and gender, one way or another. And so you can go through that kind of account for various disciplines, for most disciplines. When it comes to philosophy, we just don't have unity at the level of the object because of that freedom that we discussed. And so the other way you can go about this is to say, well, maybe we have a specific method. And that's where most people fall. They will say, we use rationality, concept manipulation, intuition, even if you're an intuitionist. But not only is there no agreement about what the method of philosophy is, any interpretation of the canon, any account of what the canon is or should be, will always include people whose methods have been completely inconsistent relative to one another. And so it seems like the only option that's available to us is to sort of define it historically, like, oh, it's this development from ancient Greece up until the present. But the argument that we also make in the article is that that's a fundamentally Eurocentric way of thinking, and it's just it's not compatible with what we know about history.
I agree with that as well, because for instance, sometimes you'll hear that Asian philosophy is not philosophy because it's religion, right? Because so much of Asian philosophy throughout the history was Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, etc., and which I find just like such a weird idea, because if you look at so much of the history of European philosophy, it's indistinguishable from theology as well. Well, by that account, we should exclude all the medieval
the very term medieval philosophy would be an oxymoron.
Exactly. But I do think that, this notion of method, there's certainly not one method to philosophy. I would say there are many methods of philosophy, although I would say there are methods of philosophy.
Yes.
But I wonder what you would say about the idea that philosophy has 3 to 4 traditional domains, and that those do define the object. Metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, logic is sometimes considered separate, sometimes not. Historically speaking, metaphysics is a very bizarre term because you talked a little bit about it earlier. It's usually associated with those things that go beyond the physical realm. Does God exist? Is there such a thing as free will? What is consciousness? However, as you of course know, but telling our viewers here who may or may not know this, historically speaking, it literally is only a term because Aristotle gave these lectures on topics we would now consider metaphysical, and they were compiled after his book on physics. So metaphysics just means after the physics, because meta can mean beyond or it can mean after. So metaphysics, I think, has a certain specificity now, but it didn't necessarily at its origin. So there's that domain of metaphysics, which includes some of the things that I just mentioned. There's value theory, which is ethics and aesthetics. There's epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. And logic, as I said, can either be considered, a separate fourth thing, or it can be considered a more methodological thing that brings those 3 together. And just to put one additional point on that, I think, going back to this idea that philosophy is broad in scope, super broad in scope, I think what you might be able to say is that you can study any particular phenomenon in the world, but at a kind of level of remove that renders it legible as within one of those domains. The apricot cocktail I can study from an aesthetic perspective. What does it taste like? What does it look like? Is it beautiful? I can study it from an ethical perspective. Am I becoming a better or worse person by drinking this apricot cocktail? Epistemology, how do I know that the apricot cocktail is out there in front of me rather than just a figment of my imagination? Metaphysics, what is the essence of the apricot cocktail?
Yeah. So I agree that all of these are sub-branches of philosophy, and they are, in fact, how the discipline understands itself in the present and historically. The problem is that no one of those subcategories can give you a separation from other disciplines. So, for example, metaphysics, although this has been historically like the sub-branch that differentiates our discipline from the rest, as I mentioned, in the 19th century, the natural sciences began making really rapid advances to the point where they started sort of making breakthroughs that had a ricochet effect on metaphysics, to the point that the argument has been made that in the 19th century, the real engine of metaphysics in Europe was not philosophy, it was physics. And it was progressing even at a speed that philosophy couldn't keep up.
You could arguably say the same today with quantum physics.
I wrote about this in that article on the history of physics, precisely. If you look at quantum physics and various other developments in 20th century physics, their concept of causation, their concept of existence, their concept of being is so much more fuzzy and funky than anything a philosopher has come up with. Yeah. And they did so and got there without the professional philosophers. So that's metaphysics, just as an example. In the domain of moral theory or ethics, that was the other one. Here, I think philosophy is largely indistinguishable with fields like political theory, for example, that also deal with normative questions about how we should live together, so that it's not the exclusive precinct of philosophy. And also theology. I mean, the history of theology is the history of trying to figure out what the good life is. And so ethical questions are at the center of the history of religion and the history of theology. And so again, you can do this with all of these sort of sub-branches. And our point at the end of this article on the groundlessness of philosophy is that philosophy can change at the level of the object. It can change at the style, the literary genre. For example, you can do philosophy by writing a novel, like a philosophical novel. You can do it through autobiography. You can do it through a traditional essay. You can do it
dialogues.
You can do it through plays. You can do it through aphorisms. There are so many modes of expression that you can use. Different forms of speech act, description, question, etc. And you can also approach philosophy with very, very disparate methods. Intuition, phenomenological description, logical analysis,
materialism, hermeneutics.
Yeah, list them all.
Yeah.
And so it's almost as if you have this buffet of methods, objects, modes of expression, and you can make any random combination of them. And what results is philosophy, but no one element is necessary for something to be philosophical.
Okay. So I wonder, going back to your initial examples of say, doing ethics in a political science department or metaphysics in a physics department, whether we would just say that those disciplines are bringing philosophy into themselves. This doesn't disrupt the identity of philosophy. It just means that other disciplines can also do philosophy. And if we think about philosophy as the love of wisdom, sure, why not?
But the question is whether they're bringing it into themselves or whether these questions are emerging from within their empirical work, so that it's not anything external that's coming into them. And then we say, oh, well, we'll put on the hat of the philosopher on you as well. Welcome to the club.
Can't we just say that philosophical questions are emerging from within those disciplines?
Of course, but then that means that philosophy is endemic to any kind of thoughtful activity.
I'd actually be very willing to say that there's a philosophical aspect of any discipline. I don't think that means that philosophy doesn't have an identity, though. And I mean, I think it depends on how we think about identity. Yes. If you're looking for a pure definition of what philosophy is, that is defining its boundaries in a very clear fashion, of course you're never gonna find that, because that's not how identities work, right? They don't, if you're looking for something that's perfectly pure, then you're looking for something that doesn't exist. And that is a metaphysical point, right? Because it's about the nature of essences.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, when we think about definitions, we typically think about a list of necessary and sufficient criteria that will allow you to say this is and this is not philosophy. And although I agree with you that identities are not pure and boundaries are porous, then we have to accept the consequence of that position, which is that if you don't have that quote unquote ideal definition, that means that you cannot make clear judgments about what is not philosophy. You can make positive judgments about what is, but you cannot make exclusions.
Okay.
And so we're never in a position to say, this book, no, that one is clearly philosophy.
Taking back philosophy and introduction.
Let's say that I just pick up like a novel, for example.
Yeah.
If I were to be a philosopher, and many philosophers take this position, they'll say, this is not philosophy, this is literature.
Yeah.
Those judgments are suddenly off the ground, and our only conclusion is that there is no ground for making those exclusions.
Well, and let me say that I do find the charges of that is not philosophy often irksome, because you hear this, those who have seen my continental philosophy, what is it and why is it a thing video will know this. Those who leverage this are often analytic philosophers who have a super narrow idea of what philosophy is, without realizing that their narrow idea of what philosophy is very, very recent. And so, like, I hear that a lot. I mean, it's like, oh, that person doesn't do philosophy, they do XYZ. I remember one of our friends got told during graduate school, you're not studying philosophy, you're studying the passing fashions of the day.
In what context? What they studied, do you remember?
Affect theory.
Okay.
But I really want to push back on this idea that if we can't offer necessary and sufficient conditions for what philosophy is, that we can't make, quote, clear judgments. Because I think
clear negative judgments.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so first off, if we can make clear positive judgments, then that seems like a cool thing to be able to do, right? But I also think there's something going on in that introduction of clear. Because what you said is we can't make clear judgments. You didn't say we can't make judgments.
We cannot make defensible judgments, I'll say it that way.
Okay. But I'm not sure whether that would be required. Like, for instance, you could pull a Wittgenstein and say that what we're looking for in defining philosophy is family resemblance, right? There's a general kind of...
That is our view.
Okay, so that to me, a family resemblance view is not a disavowal of definitions. It's a very loose sense of what a thing means, right? Where it's like, oh, I kind of know it when I see it. And so I think I worry a little bit about this deflationary move of saying if we can't offer necessary and sufficient conditions of what philosophy is, then there is no boundary to philosophy. We can just say it's a fuzzy boundary.
But I mean, a fuzzy boundary by definition is not a boundary at all, because it doesn't block movement. If it's porous, things get through. So the motivation here, just to maybe put this in to frame this and to give more context, our goal was precisely to go after those people who make negative judgments about what is not philosophy and who feel entitled to say things like...
Confucian philosophy is not philosophy.
Exactly. I mean, this is how the paper begins. The paper begins by tackling this Eurocentric tendency that we find in contemporary academic philosophy to dismiss entire geographical regions and all the cultural productions that come from them as non-philosophical, by appealing to some definition of philosophy that is very narrow, very arbitrary, and in every case historically contingent. But the problem is that, again, a lot of professional philosophers feel entitled to do that. And so we're trying to argue for a more pluralistic way of thinking about philosophy, which means giving up this pretense that you can define it.
Okay. So final question here
sorry.
is...
Just kicked you.
Oh, it's fine.
This is my way of saying, like,
gentle.
You have very hard questions.
If that's right, and so I hear you that there's this motivating force to be more inclusive. If that's right, though, what are you going to say to the dean who comes back and says, well, your article has shown that there is no discipline of philosophy as such, and so I'm going to cut my philosophy department? How can we defend philosophy departments in an anti-humanistic age, in an anti-intellectual age, given this?
Oh, so if theoretically I'm having a chat with the dean, I'm gonna say, you misunderstood that article. We believe philosophy has clear boundaries and it needs to exist.
I need a good faith answer.
So this is the good faith answer about what I would do if I were in that strategic negotiation space. I would defend my philosophical position. I don't think needs to guide my strategic thinking to protect a philosophy department. I really don't. And so if I'm giving you now the kind of answer that you want,
yes, please.
I do.
Because I'm not satisfied at all with that one.
Yeah, no, but I do defend that. So again, this is the difference between the impossibility of exclusions versus the very reasonable possibility of inclusions.
Yeah.
And so we can identify things that are philosophy, and we can talk about the value of those activities being housed in a central place and being the focus of the education and formation of young minds, our students, and offering something unique, which is a place for the concentration of those questions that include different methods, different objects, different forms of expression. And for me, that's sort of, in some ways, this is kind of the aphoretic or paradoxical ending of our argument, is that maybe the uniqueness of philosophy is its groundlessness. Its groundlessness. And so the question is whether there is value in pursuing an activity without foundation, and my answer is yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't checked out our podcast, Overthink, where we do talk about philosophy in relation to everyday life, please do. We have a Patreon as well, and I know many of you already know us from the YouTube channel here, but the podcast you can find on all podcast platforms. I'm Ellie Anderson, and this is David Peña-Guzmán.